Welcome to the J3U University podcast. I'm your host, John Jewett.
And I'm your co-host, Luke Miller.
Our mission is to elevate the physique coaching standard
and deliver the highest level of competitors to the stage.
Let's jump into today's episode. Fat loss diet mistakes. Luke and I have covered muscle building mistakes made during dieting with... Let me just start this over. Fat loss diet mistakes. Luke and I have covered muscle gain diet mistakes. So today, since we're in contest prep season, we're going to dive into what are some common mistakes that you should be avoiding moving into your fat loss or contest prep phases. Luke, how's it going? Are you in a fat loss phase or a muscle gain phase?
I'm in a stay at 220 to 225 phase because that's where I feel very comfortable. But I love seeing like the different ways that people respond to the start of dieting. And I think that's kind of where this conversation starts is it's like, what does the beginning portion of diet look like? Because that to me is where people make the biggest mistake and put themselves behind the eight ball. So like when you see people starting preps, John, like what's the biggest things that stand out to you as far as like the biggest mistakes in that portion of the dieting phase?
Yeah, at least on the initial part and where I've made my own mistakes in the past was just starting off the calorie deficit too conservative was a thing that I did with the idea of like getting the most from the least. And then like, so you have some cards to play later on. Yeah. It ends up you save those cards and you have to play them all later on. And then you're like, damn, I just played my whole hand and I run out of time. So that was like the past situation of like, then you like get behind and you have to like get overly aggressive towards the end. It wasn't until later on where like, and even now, like we have like science coming out to kind of verify this on more aggressive deficits on the beginning of a fat loss phase when you have the greatest ability to maintain tissue would be making sure you're starting the fat loss phase off like aggressive enough.
Yep. 100%. I think there's multiple things that you can look at too for this. It could be like the initial diet change and kind of how you go about that. One of the things I don't like seeing, and we do see this in a lot of client plans, is too large of like caloric rotations trying to drive the deficit. Like they're very training performance logbook based. So they keep their training day food quite a bit higher. And then they drop the rest day food way down thinking I can just drive the deficit by taking a larger chunk out of the rest day, which I think it's not long-sighted enough. Like it's pretty short-sighted move in regards to keeping a contest prep rolling throughout the entirety of the contest prep, because ultimately contest prep's just fat loss in a fatigue management state. Like you're pushing as hard as you can for fat loss to occur while keeping someone in a place that they can still adapt to the deficit. And this attachment to performance and attachment to logbook, while it's important for retaining tissue, we don't need to have such a caloric intake on training day be that differential from rest days, because those days that are off are also contributing to recovery capacity that is also going to contribute to your performance in following days. And so I'd rather see like a net change across the entirety of the diet. A lot of my clients too, like they'll have caloric rotations in all seasons for digestion purposes, but man, I'll borderline almost eliminate the rotation and caloric intake with the start of prep. Like it doesn't need to be super high in my opinion.
So when you have that situation with a client, are you pulling most of the calories off of the training day to where then they get pretty close to the same, or is it just like a little bit less pulled off of the non-train days? Like how do you look at that for that particular client?
Yeah, typically it'll be pulled off of both. It's just a little less pulled off the non-training day. Sometimes I'll even pivot people into a single meal plan where the only differential is the intra-workout carbohydrate exposure. Like if they have intra-workout carbohydrate powder, makes for execution to be really easy. They don't have any excuse to not be prepared. Like it's a quick and easy way to make sure the consistency is at a high level because their food's not changing day to day. Really, the only thing is supplementation around training. So that's kind of how it goes. Like I'll start people with 20% deficit straight off the cuff, like no problem, like super easy, and it just gets them flying. Because when I look at that fat loss chart that I make for people in either in their timelines if I want them to see it, or I make it in a document for myself if I don't want them to see it, what I'm doing is I'm watching that 1% rate of loss, and I'm wanting to get close to that 1% rate of loss for that first portion of prep, because that puts me in a position where I can run 0.5 or less almost at back end of prep, where it's like I'm not really even barely running fat loss the last 4 to 5 weeks for most people.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point around, for one, how much are you pulling off the start? And I usually advise people, hey, don't go over 30% of a calorie deficit off the front of a prep. And if you're having to make that timeline, you probably want to expand your timeline out a bit longer, just because more aggressive fat loss phases as very well could be suited for over a short term. Over the long term is when you probably accumulate too much fatigue and it wouldn't be sustainable across 16 plus weeks of a contest prep. But to bring to your point, like, hey, 20 to 25% could be a very good starting point. And if you do need to make up a little bit more of that, doing it off the output side. So a lot of times I'll bump up steps or add a little bit of cardio in, but the majority of that chunk coming from the diet. And, you know, we're all trying to create that weekly rate of loss that's going to align for the timeline. And how we do that, there's a lot of flexibility within that. So you don't have to go to a straight every single day. Being a diet monotonous, as that might psychologically not align best with the client profile as well. But for the clients that I have on like larger amounts of calories, where in the off season, you have to get pretty strategic with where you put food. So like, you know, one client with really high amounts of food, training day, hunger is a lot higher. So it makes a lot of sense that we put a lot of calories into that day. So a lot of the food is coming off that day. And then the rotation is a much less aggressive moving to the fat loss phase versus maybe a female client on lower food, where it just really isn't that big of a rotation. And their output on a training versus a non-training day, it's not that vast. And what I found is the bigger you are, the more vast it becomes. Like a big body's burn a lot of calories. So, you know, some people are like, you don't need more than 500 calories on a training versus non-training day. Like, dude, get to like 260 plus, forcing a body weight that you're not supposed to be at. Like, you will burn through it, and especially strong individuals that tolerate a lot of training volume. Yeah. So anyway, you have just some different tools to create that deficit. If you saw that question on the forum we had, someone asked, like, I'm going to the fat loss phase, I need to create my deficit. Like, how should I structure my high day? And it's kind of thinking a little backwards about it. Because you're like, well, you know, you want a 20% deficit for the weeks, for instance. If you want one high day, like to add in another 10% of calories to that day, you need to make it up somewhere else. So you need to get like a 25% reduction on whatever, 4 days out of the week. And then it gets just really complicated. So you would have to align with that. I think some people, they don't even do that. They just take calories out of their every day. Then a high day gets kind of arbitrary of like, well, I'm going to double carbohydrate on this day. It's like, well, what about like what does that mean for your calorie balance for the total week? So I think that might get a little bit into our next topic, but too large rotations could be problematic for the recovery piece and managing fatigue. But some rotation could be plausible for those that have the psychological aspect that would benefit from a diet that would be less monotonous.
I'm gonna make a shirt that says pre-planned high days are overrated, and we're gonna have that on the back and then the J3U University on the front, because I think it's a product of not doing step one correctly. Like, you're not matching the rate of loss with the timeline appropriately, and as a result, you're having to dig yourself out of the hole with food. When if you're having to dig yourself out of a hole in the first place, which is normal for a prep, you'll have that sometimes. Man, an activity adjustment down is a massive one for most people. But I digress before we get too far off topic. I do think that kind of brings us into refeeding too often, because the longer I do this, the preps that are the smoothest and the preps that get to the final outcome the easiest are always the ones that seem to have the least amount of refeeds and the least amount of need. And a lot of the times this has to do with how strict the individual is with their schedule and how well they execute the contest prep, how well they manage their time, and how adaptive they are to the contest prep response in the sense that they move fat loss along pretty steadily each week because they've done the work on the forefront to set up the prep, but they've also got their life variables in play where they're not driving stress or fatigue really high, or they're not running into all these roadblocks. And I think really the topic to discuss is just refeeding happens too often for a variety of different reasons, in my opinion. But I think it's something that would definitely be a huge mistake if you kind of went down that path.
Yeah. Back when, well, high days, refeeds, they've been part of dieting culture for a long, long time. Mm-hmm. But the idea used to be like, right, keep your metabolism from slowing down, speed up metabolism, just keep your moving, prevent your fat loss from stalling. Then we're like kind of learning to find out like, okay, that's not really the aspect around refeeds that's beneficial, but there is potential around preventing loss of tissue. We saw some of these other studies starting to come out around like a 5 on, 2 off kind of like rotation or diet breaks. And a lot of the studies don't quite translate over competitors, but some were. So we see like pre-planned refeeds were then a thing, but it also extends the timeline for our contest prep as well. Now, kind of fast forward now is like, well, what should really guide us around if we're using refeeds or not? And I think people are trying to build their diets based on the research of what we're seeing. And that wasn't really what we should be doing. It should be based around like, why are these being done? What are the benefits of them? Then how do we leverage that for those benefits? And so, what we probably see more out of refeeds is like when you are in a state where training's suffering, that it brings you back to a state where you could have some training performance and maintain tissue. Also, there's definitely the psychological benefit of dropping off fatigue, maybe some improvements of sleep, and that in turn allows you to continue the deficit and keep moving at high output. So those should really be our assessment tools of when these refeeds should be going in. And on the front end of prep, you're not going to be really running into those. And as we know, it's not really going to be preventing metabolic down regulation from occurring. Like that's occurring either way. If anything, you're just extending your prep timeline. So with refeeds off the front clip of a prep, they don't quite make sense because you're not really getting to a state of glycogen depletion where training is really being problematic. And what I come across more is that fatigue accumulates more from the training side or the cardiovascular output side. And it's a lot of times from people that have, more inconsistency within their daily prep to where we can't control as much, and some days kind of creep up on someone. But the solution to that isn't from adding a refeed in, because I don't see as much fatigue drop as I do with removing the issue that started the problem, which is the output side. So we kind of coined the term like de-output days, where a complete removal from training and cardio and step reduction, just a full-on rest. In turn, the diet stays the same, but it puts someone back towards a maintenance or slight surplus, and that's the bigger fatigue drop that can allow them to keep moving in a contest prep. However, refeeds on the tail end of a prep, when you are getting very glycogen depleted and training performance is starting to suffer, that starts to bring in the logic and rationale of utilizing a refeed, with the caveat that it doesn't take away from the end goal of being stage lean. And I think that's where you have to get really cautious with what does your refeed look like, and slowly implementing. When Luke created I took this from one of your lectures and put it into our coursework, kind of like how you incrementally go about testing refeeds and moving someone up across a prep so you don't lose time. Because I've made that mistake earlier in coaching. It's like, all right, client's dieting 200 grams of carbs, I'm going to bump it to 400. Then they're like gain 3 pounds, and it takes them like another 3-4 days to get back to a baseline. Then you now only have a week where you had like 2 days of that week of like productive fat loss. You're like, shit, I pretty much just lost a week here.
Yep.
So there should be strategically implemented and monitoring the response of a client to where you don't lose any of your timeline. And I guess that's the problem, right, Luke? Like on the front end, it's just way too easy to lose a lot of your time.
Yes, you can lose so much because that refeed, just like the response is sticky almost, like it stays with the client so long. And I think the point that I want to pull out before we move into the next topic is it's not the primary goal. The primary goal is to get into contest shape. And so there are preps where you have to dig those last 7, 8, 9, 10 weeks just to make sure that you get there, where refeeds are kind of few and far between. But if you're in a place where you can utilize them, which happens when you push the front portion of the prep and you're ahead, it allows for that to be plugged in as needed for performance retention. So I think there's a mindset shift that has to happen. Like, we can't replace getting in contest shape as the primary goal with making sure refeeds are a part of the prep as the primary goal, because I do know that people get pretty emotionally attached. Well, this client's getting refeeds, why am I not? Or they see it, kind of pervade in social media culture, because good grief, the day in the life of like, see what I eat videos. Or
what does John get sushi and I don't?
Oh man, it's so funny. But it's like, you have to be so specific to what each person can respond to in regards to what you're putting in, so that you aren't removing that time. Like when you go get sushi, it's because you're ordering the same exact thing and your response to it, and that it's not sticky where you're losing that week of fat loss. It's enough to pull you back up, but then it's pulling you back down at a quick rate to keep you on track. So it's a hard dynamic to communicate, because as someone preps, it starts to flip, right? You start to see like that desire for contest lean for some people start to move kind of equal to wanting the refeeds. And we have to make sure that people are reminded that refeeds not the primary goal, used as needed to achieve the primary goal of contest shape.
Thanks everyone for tuning in to today's podcast. Are you struggling to hit your peak on show day? Feeling lost in the off season? Upgrade your coaching game with J3 University. Our program covers everything from off season to contest prep to peak week, all based from real client results. Along with our comprehensive physique curriculum, you'll also get access to our 4 rooms with our J3U team to answer any questions you have, and live Q&A sessions to further your coaching and athlete experience. We are the source of education for top IFBB pros and coaches. Join us to elevate the coaching standard at J3 University. Let's get back to today's podcast. Yeah, and with getting into food variety on prep, we kind of get into the topic around which could be a mistake made is macro matching. Now, that's not to say that don't ever do it. It's just that it can take you down a path of making errors in utilizing it. With, for one, I think on the coaching side is that there's kind of a question mark or vagueness around what someone's eating, and might leave you when a problem does arise. Where do you really start? So if you have someone just off numbers and you're not able to actually see their food sources they're utilizing, for one, they might have shifts in what they eat. And if it's prior to a check-in day, maybe they had more sodium bump for that day. You see their check-ins and they look softer, their weight's up. You're like, man, do I need to be more aggressive? And that's just a fluid shift. It's not actually representative of the rate of fat loss that's occurring. So that's one thing. When it gets a little too inconsistent with shifting of foods, that could be a problem. Then, the other one is like, as you're getting farther down the dieting process and stress is higher in the body, the GI tract can get a little finicky. You can start running into GI problems. And if I knew exactly what someone was eating and we could identify it in a meal pretty quickly, you can shift and make those adjustments pretty fast. If not, you're like, okay, let me see your whole diet plan. Like, when are you having this problem? They're like, well, these meals are changing. I'm subbing in these macros here. And so it creates a delay in the timeline of figuring out problems if they were to rise. So on the coaching side, those are at least 2 of the problems that I could see come out like earlier on, not even talking about peak week, but that's at least earlier on in prep.
Yeah, it's so funny because I coach a few what I term as advanced dieters. So people who are good at this, like that run macros for their preps, like especially the first half, especially like I just give them macros. So Emily King's one of them, Mitchell's one of them. But when we get to the back end of prep, like it goes from like me just giving the macros to like, hey, like this is the foods and this is the meals, and we're kind of running this into a peak. Because, man, the quickest way to screw a peak is to start to do this inaccurately, like with what you're plugging in from a meal by meal perspective as far as digestion, right? Because you're not only controlling for like the macronutrients that go in, but you're also controlling for the micronutrients. But tertiary, the digestion piece of it, when macros come up for loading, is such a quick way for people who have been dieting for so long, even if they're advanced dieters, seeing those macros and plugging in foods that may have been fine in off season, but as you get through contest prep, there's not that tolerable, or they do drive some bloating. And that to me is just not worth it. So when I see macro matching as far as a part of a contest prep, it's not that it can't be done. It's that the tolerance that you give yourself has to be much narrower for a contest prep, in my opinion, and then potentially even removed once you get to that last piece, because it needs to be so predictable by the time you're running a peak that it's not a question of if the macro matching is getting in the way. And it's so simple to screw it up. Like, we've talked about this before, but like subbing seafoods, like one shrimp for a different shrimp that you buy at a different grocery store, having quadruple the sodium, or even just like switching sauces. Like, I've seen people go to a show, and it's those shows that have expos at them, right? They buy a sauce at the expo, and it either drives GI issues or it has different like sodium content relative to their other sauces. And it's just so frustrating on the coaching end, because you spent 18, 20, 24 weeks doing everything so well to have something like that start to mess it up, you know?
Yeah. And that, the other thing is the volume side.
The volume side too. Yeah.
And people started shifting to foods that are more voluminous, which you can make a pretty large plate of food that still fits within some macros. But another thing about getting on stage is like, you need the devs to create fat loss, but you also need to be able to control your waist. So if you're spending all day long with descended waist, you can't train it to the absolute smallest ability all prep long. That's leaving some ground on the table that you could be gaining. Then also the fiber part of the equation. Some people might be just looking at carbs, protein, fats, but if you're not accounting for fiber, for one, bloating could be a problem. Or even if you had someone that's low carb, you need a certain amount of those carbs being able to fuel training. And now we're getting to the muscle retention side of the equation, where if they're eating a ton of fiber, where we have the idea that most of that carb should be going into fueling training and recovery, then we're having limitations now for the muscle retention side. So, a few things that it could be accounted for. It's like you said, Luke, it's probably making sure guidelines are in place if you're using that approach. Like, hey, I need you doing 5 meals per day. And maybe those macros are now accounted to each of those meals rather than being a total for the day. So no one's trying to macro save and eat more of them in the evening, or just go to a strategy that's more psychologically based over outcome based for the physique. And I think that's where you have to start shifting things around for people. And, tail end of prep, I've been there. If you have macros, you start planning out the most strategic way to eat the most palatable, voluminous food that you can to just lessen the burden of hunger. And when you're getting to that, hey, it's time to hang up the macros, because it's not going to be psychologically benefit for you. And then you get to the back end of prep, when it's all over, you're like, I wasted so much of my life thinking about food and macros when I could have been more productive. So
I'm laughing because I've been there, man. I remember that last prep was Jolly Rancher cucumbers. It was Jolly Rancher drink packets sprinkled on cucumbers.
Oh my God.
It's so funny when you look back though. Like you just gotta laugh. Man.
The other side of this, the mistake is being too strict with no variety to a degree. Yeah. And again, like a lot of this macros versus strict meal plan, I think it does get into the psychology of the dieter, but I still see problems when you have the meal plan I just rotate between chicken rice and beef and rice. And that's what you do for weeks on end. For one, like micronutrients are missing, fiber's missing. There's a lot of benefits around these two areas. And then the long term, I think, is very important to consider for GI health. And we see just more GI problems cropping up from eating the same foods over and over and over, with a lack of fiber in bodybuilding, lack of microbiome diversity in bodybuilders, easily because of lack of fiber and lack of fiber diversity as well. So I think in the long term, we need to think about our gut health and our ability to continue the dieting process. But even the short term, being able to have something more sustainable and less burdensome. Because I've been on these diets for prep where it's just chicken rice and beef and rice or some fish. And man, there is a less burdensome way to diet and enjoy the process more. And I'm all about putting in the work. And if I need to work harder, absolutely, I'll take it there. But I don't think we need to create a meal plan or a cardio plan that intentionally elicits the most suffering possible, quote unquote, when there could be an as effective, less fatiguing way to do so. And so even with prep, there's a physical fatigue, there's a mental fatigue, but it all adds up to our total allosteric load that we can handle in prep. And going over that, you just end up stalling someone out. But a lot of people need to be coached and brought up through this process and advanced to the point where, hey, they could go to a very strict approach and handle it. But if you're having people crack, it's like, is that you? And they just need to suck it up? Or, do you need to modify your approach and become an actual coach and kind of nurture these people through the process and find strategies to lessen the burden and just use semaglutide and Ozempic. I'm just kidding on that. But kind of along the lines, like we should meet in the middle here of like where we're able to have some flexibility within dieting, but also strictness where it applies, but making sure that diet still guides them for a short term of getting fat loss and on stage, but then also over the long term of being able to sustain this process over years of doing this.
Yeah. And I think one last thing on like the diet piece, I guess that last point, I think it's a good one to touch before we before we kind of log off, because it kind of comes off the back of too strict and no variety. I think there's so much value in that. Like you can have someone follow a meal plan and have that variety built in. And a lot of times people, as we start to pivot into like, especially those preps that you have to push hard, this is such a good thing to notice or to keep track of, is you're starting to get into some protein veggie meals, and then those protein veggie meals become multiple meals, right? And protein, the total protein intake, a lot of times can be a little bit too high for what you need on that back end of dieting. And it's a pretty simple macro swap to just pull that protein down and plug in carbohydrates on that equal gram per gram basis and be able to support training a bit more. And I've done this on the back end of preps multiple times, and honestly probably saved contest preps from like putting someone on stage, not quite there, maybe a little stringy, to still being able to train and perform and retain tissue. And it's something that's so huge to realize that as you get through this prep, like it's pretty easy to have protein be so high that it's actually could be swapped for something that's more beneficial to the prep process from a performance perspective.
Yeah, and some people might be thinking, like, I know you just said a gram per gram basis, right? And yes, they are calorie equated, but say, hey, thermic effect of food's higher for protein, like metabolically, it's not quite the same.
Right.
But what the thing around this is that when you're getting to a state like we're talking about here, is that shift now increases someone's output and ability to train harder, move more throughout the day, that from a net aspect of output versus calories in, it's an improvement. And you can see someone start actually dropping body fat because of it, because they just start outputting more. And then even their training performance improves. So that's part of why we could even do a gram for gram swap out in that instance. And then, protein, it can definitely help with appetite and hunger, but that only just to such a far degree. In that if you're actually dropping off more fatigue with having higher carbohydrate, that could actually be the greater benefit. And I think satiety point of carbohydrate or protein is a little overstated to a degree. So I digress a bit on there, but I think, the protein only goes so far. It's far more beneficial to utilize the substrate that we mainly use in our training, which is carbohydrate.
Yeah.
So, but I think we'll wrap it up there, everyone. Those are some major fat loss diet mistakes that we've seen and kind of evolved thinking on too for ourselves in coaching. If you have any questions or some other diet mistakes, leave them down in the comments below. And thanks for tuning in. We'll talk to you next time.